now your president, right? Because McKinley was assassinated and Roosevelt gets kicked upstairs, so to speak. His background is very interesting. He's from New York. He was a Customs House official for years. He became the Assistant Secretary to the Navy. Then he started the Rough Riders that, of course, went into the Spanish-American War and stormed up San Juan Hill. He comes home from the Spanish-American War and he becomes the governor of New York for a couple of years. And he really started to crack down on corporate greed and the corruption that was taking place in New York businesses and politics. And he sort of put the kibosh on a lot of those practices. So the corporate minds that were in the Republican Party wanted to sort of get rid of him and reduce his amount of power. So they're the ones that suggested he become the vice president under McKinley, because the vice president is a, wasted job, so to speak. So they're the ones that suggested he go there. And that didn't last too long. So now he is the president, and his motto is going to be speak softly, carry a big stick, and you will go far. It's an old African saying, and he adopts it as his own. Now, his first big endeavor that he's going to undertake is one that would outlast his presidency, Taft's presidency, and go into Wilson's presidency. But he begins it because there was a real interest in the United States in building a canal through Latin America. There was that isthmus that connects North America to South America, rather skinny piece of land, only a few miles wide. So there was a real interest in building this canal here in Central America. And why do we want to do that? Because it's going to give us a two-ocean navy, and if the Spanish-American War did nothing else, it really proved to us that we needed better transportation between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans rather than running all the way around South America to get there. So that was going to help us tremendously. And it's also going to help trade. So the bottom line is money, and that's going to help as well. We didn't know if we wanted to build it in Nicaragua or Panama. It really depended on which nation was willing to work with us. Here's what happens. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty is signed, and that's going to give us sort of permission to build the canal in the Panama region. The problem is going to be Colombia. They're going to be the real obstacle because Colombia owns Panama at this time. And they weren't ready to give it up. They weren't ready to give in to the Americans, and basically the Colombians said, whoa, time out. You Panamanians can't make your own agreement with the Americans. You belong to us. So Teddy Roosevelt says, Colombia, we're not fooling around here. We're not going to take your grief, and I'll take the canal zone if I need to. So it's on. Now, the Panamanian Revolution breaks out. Really doesn't sound like we've heard about this in history, have we? Because it is literally this big. So, Panama Revolution breaks out November 3rd, 1903. Yeah, it's really just a day. There are a couple of deaths in this revolution. A Chinese civilian is killed, and a donkey. Yeah, I'm serious. So, is it really a big deal, this Panamanian Revolution? Not unless you're that Chinese civilian, or the donkey. So the U.S. Navy, what they do is the Colombians started to sort of mass their troops at the border of Panama, and they were going to invade Panama, and this revolution would have taken a lot longer to play out. But the Americans we weren't going to get involved, but we stationed our warships off the coast of Colombia and basically pointed our guns at them and said, where are you going? You don't think you're going into Panama, do you? Because we're bigger than you are. And the Colombians backed right off, and Panama was able to declare their independence. Well, we don't waste any time. John Hay signs the Hay-Bonao-Varea Treaty. Bonao-Varea is one guy. So the Hay-Bonao-Varea Treaty is signed, and what that says is that the United States has full permission to build the canal in Panama, and this is what we're going to pay for it, and this is what we're going to get. We're going to pay $10 million up front for that land, and then we're going to give them an annual stipend of $250,000 a year. And that was supposed to go for like 99 or 100 years. Jimmy Carter would actually back us out of that treaty during his administration, which is fine because we still have use of the Panama Canal. And really, what does $250,000 mean in the late 20th century. Means a lot to me, but not to a country. So, and what we get from that is a 10-mile stretch in Panama where this canal is going to exist. So the building of the canal is not an easy project. It's going to take us about 10 years to build this canal, and the men that are really important in the building of that are Colonel Goethals. And Goethals, he's basically the project manager on this deal. He's the one that organizes and creates the system by which the canal is going to be built. He sort of oversees the whole operation, okay, from a logistical point of view. And then we had a lot of problems in the canal zone with the tropics and just the air of the tropics. So lots of mosquitoes, lots of yellow fever, really a health hazard down there. We lost more men building the canal than we did in a couple of wars we fought previously. So they send in Colonel William Gorgas, and his job, he's a doctor, and his job is to go in and basically eradicate yellow fever and get rid of it, and then deal with the other health issues that were cropping up in that place. The canal is finally finished in 1914. It cost us about $400 million to finally finish that canal. And again, this is during Wilson's administration. James Bryce, who's an English writer, said that the Panama Canal was the greatest liberty man has ever taken with nature. Think about what we did there. We excavated miles of land, cleared it out, emptied it, and created a waterway that would exist to go from one ocean to another. He's seriously right? The greatest liberty man has ever taken with nature. Now, other issues that Teddy Roosevelt's going to have when it comes to foreign policy. Well, we're going to have some more trouble in Latin America. Latin Americans weren't real happy with the whole building of the Panama Canal. They really saw us as taking advantage of Panama, and they didn't like that whole process. So a lot of Latin American countries were in debt, especially to European countries, and these European countries were sort of inflicting their power on these Latin American countries because they weren't paying their debts. They felt like they had a right to impose their will. Germany is one of those. Germany shoots down 2 Venezuelan gunboats and leads an invasion into Venezuela in the early 1900s. They really exert their force. So Roosevelt comes up with a policy of preventive intervention, and it's based on the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. He ties it to the Monroe Doctrine by adding a corollary to it, so it becomes the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And what it basically says is that European nations are not allowed to intervene in Latin America at all. If Latin America has a problem, we will pay off their debts, we will run their custom houses, and we will control their trade until we get them back on their feet again. Not the best news for Latin America, but at least Europe wasn't intervening. Now, this is much more strict and harsh than the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine called for non-intervention, non-colonization by anyone. This says the United States has full right to intervene. So we sort of make an exception for ourselves. So this goes further. But it's accepted on the world stage because he ties it to the Monroe Doctrine. Had Roosevelt just said, I'm going to issue my own doctrine, it's going to be the Roosevelt Doctrine, it would not have been accepted. But because he ties it to a known document that's already out there, the world is more apt to accept it. This makes the United States the policeman of the Caribbean, and there's a great political cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt marching through Latin America with his big stick and dressed as a cop. And so we become the policeman of the Caribbean. We're going to take care of them, we're going to monitor them, we're going to intervene where we need to. Now, also on the world stage is a situation between Russia and Japan. In China, Manchuria was sort of up for grabs. Remember, this is the whole time of imperialism in China. We had sliced it up like a pie. We tried to have the open door notes, but Russia is really eyeing up Port Arthur. Now, why does Russia want Port Arthur? Well, because it's a port, and it's a warm water port. In other words, boats can come and go freely out of there most months of the year. Think about where Russia's located, way up north, And their ports, where they have water contact around Siberia and so forth, they're iced over 12 months a year. You can't get boats in and out of there. So every time Russia could get a warm water port, they jumped on it. So they were really interested in Port Arthur because it was a warm water port, gave them access to the Pacific Ocean, more access to trade, access to have a navy over there. They were really interested. So, and Russia at the time, remember, is still run by the czars. And this is Tsar Nicholas II. Okay? Japan doesn't want Russia to have Port Arthur. They were also interested in having this. So the two countries are going to duke it out. It's going to be the Russo-Japanese War. And what happens in this war is that Tsar Nicholas, he's going to send the entire Russian Navy out of western Russia over near Moscow, St. Petersburg, and he's going to send them around to battle the Japanese. Here's the problem. They have to sail all the way around Europe, all the way around Africa, up to India, then around China, and finally into the Sea of Japan to meet up with the Japanese Navy. And this was supposed to be kept a big secret. Yeah, it takes months for the Russians to sail all that distance. And the Japanese know they're coming because it wasn't kept secret. And the Japanese totally refurbish, refit, and rebuild their navy in the meantime. They're not going anywhere. They've got all the time in the world. So they rebuild their navy, and it's completely modernized compared to the old banged up, out-of-date Russian navy. And the Japanese pummel 42 ships in the Sea of Japan as soon as they make entry. And it was really, really embarrassing. This is the first time an Asian nation puts a whipping on a European nation. That had never happened before. So Russia is really embarrassed by this whole thing. It's not good for Tsar Nicholas II. It is definitely a mark against him. Remember that he would be involved in a revolution later on in Russia in 1919, so it really gets quite ugly for Russia and for Tsar Nicholas. Now, the problem here is this, that Russia didn't have unlimited resources. They got pummeled with their losing the 42 ships. And Japan, while they seemed to be doing well to the world's eye, they were losing a lot of men in this war. They weren't really ready for a ground war, which is what takes place in Manchuria against the Russians. So Japan's running out of men, Russia's running out of money and resources. What are we going to do? Neither side wants the other side to know their weaknesses, so they both go to Teddy Roosevelt and say, you got to get me out of this. How do we solve this thing without the other side knowing that I'm pleading weak? So Teddy Roosevelt calls both sides to New Hampshire, and they settle the Treaty of Portsmouth. He mediates this whole thing. This, along with some negotiations Teddy Roosevelt does in Africa, all result in him winning in 1906 the Nobel Peace Prize. Remember that the Nobel Peace Prize, created in the late 1800s, and the creator, Nobel, Alfred Nobel, was the inventor of dynamite. Doesn't sound like a guy that would create a peace prize, right? But Nobel created dynamite in order to increase the efficiency of mines in the world and mining. So he never intended dynamite to be used for warfare. And it was really quite disappointing to him when it was. But that's the Nobel Peace Prize. Whoops. All right. Now, California. With the end of the Russo-Japanese War, a lot of Japanese immigrants decide they're going to come to the United States, and they land and make their lives in the western part of the United States, particularly California. By 1906, there's 70,000 Japanese living along the West Coast, and a lot of them live in San Francisco. They're subject to a lot of racism. It's really not a pretty picture for the Japanese on the West Coast. In 1906, San Francisco experiences a couple of major tragedies. One is a major earthquake that hits, because we know where California sits on that fault line. And the other is a huge fire that devastates the city, took out blocks and blocks and blocks of the city. It was really horrible. So losing all of the buildings, the schools, the hospitals, and so forth puts a real toll on the people of San Francisco. And they decide, the school board of San Francisco decides, they're no longer going to take Japanese students in their schools. This does not go over well in Japan, where education is highly valued. So Teddy Roosevelt, sensing that the two sides are really kind of getting angry with one another, and he doesn't want to go to war against the Japanese, he calls a meeting to mediate between the Japanese and the school board. And he gets the school board to open up schools to the Japanese again. And this settles Japan. Now, in order to sort of flex our muscle on the world stage, Teddy Roosevelt's going to send out the Great White Fleet. Great White Fleet was 16 of our finest naval vessels, that the hulls of which, the bodies of which, were all painted white. And they went on a sail around the world. They toured the world, going from port to port to port. Why? Because we just wanted to show everybody what exactly we had. Now, this works particularly well in Japan, where they signed the Root-Takahira Agreement, and the Root-Takahira Agreement agrees. The treaty basically says that both sides, the United States and Japan, would respect each other's Pacific holdings and would seek mediation in times of crisis. And they would also uphold the open door notes in China. So it works out there. We're able to further settle issues with Japan and go from there.